Myths and legends. Things that chill our bones and tickle our curiosity. Reality, or just something we inherited through history? Are you ready to find out about something new? I believe that there are only a few people among you who haven't read the book, or seen the movie Sleeping Hollow, or at least heard of the Headless Horseman. It is a popular story and spread widely. But what if I tell you that in Croatia, the headless apparition isn't just a story to tell in the gloomy nights? What if I tell you that the headless ghost sightings are real, and that there isn't in fact only a single headless ghost, but a whole legion of them? And the story doesn't end there. But we will get to that later on. Now, let's go to the beginning. The first question that popped into my mind while I was researching this phenomenon was, why are they headless? Unfortunately, everyone I asked didn't know the answer. But one lady, who wants to remain unknown, had an assumption, and I found it interesting enough to include it into this video. In the old days, when superstition had a completely different level than today, people went a bit further when it comes to protection from evil forces. This is where we come to vampires. Back in the day, if one was suspected of being a vampire, people wouldn't hold back with the desecration of a corpse. It was believed, as it is widely spread, that vampires couldn't die. Instead, they crawled out of the graves and attacked innocent people. To prevent that, people would often chop off the heads of a deceased who was suspected of being a vampire. This could easily be linked to our headless ghosts, and at the same time it takes us to a whole new level of supernatural. Are they just ghosts who are provoked and prevented of finding their peace? Is there something behind the stories about vampires? Or are they maybe the same thing? To look deeper into this, we will tell you two stories told by family members of witnesses who came face to face with a headless ghost. Unlike other stories that we heard and told, this one takes place by daytime, and for that, it is so much scarier.
It was early morning when Tony went to his vineyard. As the summer sun forced one to leave outdoor work early, he knew that he had to be done by lunchtime. Once, church bell sounds off in the distance, announcing it was 12 in the noon exactly, Tony gathered his things and started walking home. It was a half-hour walk on a dirt road that went through the field and the copies. As he walked, he didn't notice anything strange. On the contrary, he even came across a friend, whom he grew up with, and who was taking his cows on the fields. They talked for a few minutes before each went on their separate way. Not far from home, Tony suddenly noticed that something was wrong, but at first he couldn't figure out what. Soon he realized that everything around him went completely silent. There was not a single bird singing or a bug sounding off in the grass. He found it a bit strange, but at the same time ignored it because he wanted to get home as soon as possible. All of a sudden, Tony got goosebumps, as it was freezing outside, and at the same time noticed that something is walking towards him from the distance. That calmed him down. As the person he saw in the distance approached closer, Tony noticed something wasn't right, but the person was too far from him to notice what made him feel wrong. All of a sudden he started remembering all the scary stories people talked about. Unfortunately, as the bypasser came closer, Tony realized that one of the stories wasn't just something they used to scare kids with. When they were only 20 yards apart, Tony took one last look and remembered to look down. The man that was walking towards him didn't have a head, and the story said one mustn't look at the headless ghost or even greet it. Afraid and confused, Tony started walking faster and decided that once they passed each other, he will run home as fast as he can. Unfortunately, as they crossed paths, the curiosity got the best of him. Thinking that he must have seen it wrong, Tony lifted his head to look at this person that was now right in front of him. Tony said later to his granddaughter that he even saw everything. The severed spine and neck. He even saw severed, translucent skin and blood veins. In that moment, when he looked at the headless ghost, Tony stopped breathing, and the feeling of absolute fear paralyzed him. Moments later, the headless figure just vanished into thin air, and adrenaline rushed through Tony's body. He ran home as fast as he could, not turning his head.
Stories of these headless ghosts wandering all around us is spread almost to every part of Croatia. And it is interesting to say that they, unlike many evil supernatural beings, actually don't show up or act only in the darkness. That being said, you probably think, why did we choose this story when it is pretty known to the wide range of people? Well, we chose it because of the next part. It is said that once a year, every single headless ghost disappears and no one will see them wandering the countryside. And every year, it is that one single day, on December 13th, St. Lucia Day, they will all appear at the local cemetery. Allegedly, they will appear exactly at midnight, but you will only be able to see them if a Copernica, evil witch, performs a gruesome ritual prior to the night. Let me explain that in more detail. I am sending a warning out to all who have a weak stomach to skip this part of the story. On that day, locals have found scattered animal carcasses on the roads around the cemetery. People say that the stench is unbelievable, and the amount of dead animals will bring chills down everyone's spine. Their body parts can be found circled with blood and scattered even on the tree branches. As you can imagine, there is something weird about it. Not only for the poor dead animals. Decembers in Croatia are pretty much cold, and one would most likely have to store dead animals for days before scattering them. Otherwise, the cold air would prevent the meat from rotting, and therefore releasing the stench. People even say that they hear loud screams and some kind of ritual singing around graveyards, indicating that Copernica call upon the headless dead. The old stories even say how they call upon them, trying to recruit the army of the dead, but always fail. So, as always, it is up to you to figure out if you want to believe in headless ghosts or not. And for the end, you will hear the true story told to me by a local whose father used to work as a gravedigger and was one of the rare people who had the encounter with the whole procession of the dead. So, my dears, sit back and enjoy this terrifying story.
Luca and his colleague Patrick were informed that they need to dig up a grave 2 days in advance. The ground was already frozen and hard to dig through, so they needed more time to complete the job. On the first day, they were a bit lazy, so they decided to have a few drinks in the graveyard's mortuary, go home and do the double shift on the next day. The next day came, and Luca decided to walk to work because they had the drink too many last night, and he needed to get rid of a hangover. Also, it wasn't that far from his home. He walked a few feet more, when the stench became unbearable. As he walked uphill, he soon came to turn on the road, and once he passed it, shock overcame him. There, all over the road, he saw torn, bloody pieces of animal parts. Although he worked as a gravedigger for over 10 years, his stomach wasn't used to this sort of gruesome acts. Finally, he ignored the sight and rushed to the graveyard. Upon arriving there, he saw that Patrick was late to work. He called Patrick's home phone, as there were no cell phones at the time, but no one answered. Angry and frustrated, knowing Patrick wouldn't show up, he started digging. The job was hard and exhausting, and he knew it would take him a whole day to do it, but the funeral was to be held the next day, and someone had to do it. Luca worked up a schedule, 1 hour of digging and at least half hour of rest. At 2 p.m. he walked back home for lunch and to warm up. On his way back, he was shocked to see there were even more animal parts scattered over the road. Although he ignored it and decided to call the veterinary station once he came home, he felt unease by that sight. At 4 p.m., he returned to the graveyard by car, knowing he would have to work late, and had no intentions of returning home through the shortcut he took earlier, through the darkness and possibly breaking a leg on the icy road. It was exactly 11:50 p.m. when he finished the job. Finally, he crawled out of the dug-up grave, exhausted and still mad at Patrick, thinking how he will report this to their supervisor and ask for a bigger paycheck. He put a shovel in the small tool shed and locked it up when he heard a loud scream. He froze up, looking around him. Until this moment, he wasn't afraid of being alone at the graveyard at night. Dead are dead, and they stay dead, he always said. But there was something about this scream that frightened him. To death. It wasn't an animal scream, nor human. Instinctively, Luca looked on his watch and noticed it was a minute to midnight. Something just didn't feel right, so he took a shelter behind the tool shed, realizing that the sound he heard came from the direction his car was parked in. In that moment, when the church bells announced it was midnight, a horrifying scene appeared in front of his eyes. There, in the spot where on a normal day a funeral procession would start, he saw dozens and dozens faded lights appearing in straight line, as if people stood there, marching in the rows of two. But there were no people, only faded silhouettes, headless silhouettes. He observed as they started walking across the graveyard and remembered all the stories his grandfather used to tell him. Immediately, as the dead procession came closer, he looked down, shielding his view with his hand, and started running towards his car. Once he started the engine, he took another look from the distance this time, seeing that the procession stretched over the whole graveyard. Afraid and eager to lock himself in the safety of his home, Luca punched the accelerator pedal.
So, there you have it. Headless funeral procession of St. Lucia Day. Myth or reality? Restless, wrongfully accused souls, or maybe real vampires that feed on the fear of the living? It is up to you to decide. And remember, something is always lurking out there in the dark, but also in the daytime. Be sure to look away and find safety in your home. Hi again, guys. Thank you so much for sharing, and please continue. You are doing a great job. Please subscribe. We won't bite your head off.
Or will we?
Leave a comment down below and let us know what you think. So, this has once again been one of Croatia's myths and legends. My name is Jelena Hrvoj.
And I'm Daniel Fiket.
Thank you for watching, and spook you next week. Bye!
Bye.